last year, as Vincent said, there was a coup against our brother Evo Morales of Bolivia, the legitimate president of Bolivia. When the coup happened, honestly, I'm not a naive person. I better start my timer, otherwise I'm going to go on and on. I'm not a naive person, but I was quite shocked by the reaction, not only of the New York Times and the garbage media, not only their reaction, because one expected them to line up behind the United States State Department. In many ways, that entire group of media are stenographers of the Pompeos of the world. They might sniff a little bit when Mike Pompeo is speaking because he's a little vulgar for them. But they basically agree with the Pompeo-Trump approach to Venezuela, to Iran, to China, and so on. There's broad ruling class agreement in the United States. I wasn't surprised about that. I was actually surprised that the so-called Western left was lining up to cheer the coup against Evo Morales because they felt, well, as Vincent rightly said, they were saying things like, well, he lost support and so on. As if that is a sufficient reason to overthrow somebody. After all, after the third election, Evo Morales had a mandate till January. So why was he driven out of power in November? His mandate didn't end until January. Now it turns out, and Manuel Bertoldi and I have written a piece about this for Globetrotter, it turns out that a number of American political scientists have looked at the election data forensically, and they've shown that there's no question of fraud in the October 2019 election in Bolivia. No question that this was the Organization of American States playing a very dirty game, which was used by the US government and the far right wing in Bolivia to put pressure on Evo Morales and the MAS. They used General Kaliman, who had been on a training course in the United States, to go and essentially tell Morales time to leave. It was a coup. And I'm amazed and quite shocked that sensible people are still unwilling to call it for what it was. What the hell else was it? It was a coup d'etat against a person who had governed for 14 years. I want people to think about this. Today is the birthday of Eduardo Galeano, one of my great friends and a superb writer, great inspiration to people like us. Eduardo, in Open Veins of Latin America, writes about the destruction of what becomes Bolivia from the time of the conquest out till, yesterday. The destruction, the resources taken out of their large indigenous population, completely set aside, marginalized, treated as labor, not treated as human beings. And then arrives MAS, then arrives Evo, then arrives that whole movement that after Cochabamba, after the gas wars, the water wars, they come to office in Bolivia and they start a process of democratizing society and, mark this, democratizing the economy. When we talk about anti-capitalist movements in the global south, it's not about, human rights and democracy, fellas. It's about democratizing the economy. And that's what Evo and MAS do in Bolivia. It's because of that they had to get rid of Morales, because he was one of the last shining lights of governments which had been able to totally pivot and transform an economy that had been utterly treated as an imperial outpost of multinational US and Canadian companies. Let's not forget the Canadians. Over 60% of mining companies are based in Canada, things like Barrick Gold and so on. The Canadian and US companies have treated Bolivia essentially as the place from which they've stripped out whatever wealth is possible and left the people behind. Well, Morales, just before the coup, was at the UN and he laid out a bunch of statistics, showed that poverty had declined in Bolivia from about 38% of the population to around 15%, that life expectancy had risen by 9 full years, that because of MAS, because of the struggle of the women comrades in MAS, more than 50% of the people in the legislature in Bolivia were women representatives. These were substantial gains for a country that had been treated so wretchedly by imperialism and colonialism. And it's a bloody irony that we live in a world where the colonial and imperial countries are the ones that come out there and they tell us what human rights are. I am unprepared to listen to the US government lecture me about human rights. I don't want Boris Johnson of all goddamn people to tell me about human rights. I don't need the French to go to Beirut and tell people about good governance and human rights. And I certainly don't want the Belgians to walk around the Congo or the Dutch to stroll around in Indonesia in their nice cut suits talking about human rights. These people are yet to apologize for the history of colonialism, and they're yet to provide adequate reparations. You know what would be a good beginning? We don't want their reparations as such unless we can seize it from them. A good beginning is if they totally cancel the $13 trillion of debt, which is going to increase during this COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath. They don't even want to suspend debt payments. They're unwilling to do that, let alone cancel the debt. We are demanding a total cancellation of all debt. There should be no question that the London Club and the Paris Club should have no rights at any table to talk about debt servicing. You know why I'm saying this to you? If I go to a casino and I put money down on, Black 19 or whatever, and my number doesn't come up, I lose the money. But the way the Paris and London clubs, these are the debt securing agencies work, when these Western banks and wealthy bondholders lend money to Argentina or when they lend money to Indonesia, whether the ball comes on their number or not, they get paid. And I think they have stopped, being essentially penalized for taking bad decisions. It's the banks and the bondholders that don't deserve to be paid anymore. They use the stick they have, the military clout, the instruments of hybrid war, the instruments of coup d'etat. They use this to secure their power over the well-being of people. Our anti-capitalist movements in the global south are not able to develop, to grow, to breathe, because these wealthy bondholders, governments that back them and so on, use every instrument possible, including the coup d'etat, to get their way. Let's be straight about this. Evo Morales was not overthrown in November 2019 because of something that happened on the 20th of October in 2019 in an election. From the first day that he was elected and voted into power, the US ambassador was trying to undermine Evo Morales from the first day. And we know this thanks to a very brave person, Chelsea Manning. And because Chelsea Manning was able to get those State Department cables, she handed them into Julian Assange. Julian Assange, to me, is a personal hero. On the 7th of September, the British government, to its eternal shame, there's so many things the British government should be ashamed that it's done in history, but now, again, to its eternal shame, is going to open extradition hearing to extradite Julian Assange to the United States. And I seriously hope every one of you listening is going to be out there banging the drum against the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States, because they are going to put him into prison for life, if not do something worse to Julian. A brave person published what Chelsea Manning had found. And in those WikiLeaks cables, we know, we hear, we can see the US ambassador from the beginning, from day one, wanting to undermine Evo Morales and the agenda of Mars, which is an agenda of resource socialism. In other words, using the fruits of the resources, whatever money is gained, to turn it around to help the well-being of the people. I mean, that's what they were using the wealth of Bolivia for 14 years. And that's how they were able to reduce the poverty rate and so on. The government was overthrown in a coup d'etat. One of our anti-capitalist movements, they attempted to suffocate with that coup d'etat, and they've killed so many of our comrades in the aftermath. Just as they've been systematically killing our comrades in Colombia, in India, across the world. I mean, the attack on our people, including in South Africa, the attack on Abaklali in Southern Africa, the shack dwellers movement, is something that you've got to pay attention to and lift your voices in places like the United Kingdom, Europe, and so on. Don't let them forget what's being done in the name of the wealthy bondholders. Well, they do all that. That's all very well. They overthrow Evo Morales. And then Janet Áñez, who is the so-called president of Bolivia, has essentially suspended elections forever. There will not be elections for an entire year. And I haven't read one editorial in the Guardian, so-called liberal media, New York Times, not one editorial condemning the government of Bolivia for running a government for an entire year without an election. They supported the coup against Evo, saying it was an undemocratic election. For God's sake, that was an election. She has never had an election. And I haven't seen you once sniff your nose at that. Human Rights Watch. Ken Roth has been the head of Human Rights Watch as long as the dictator Mubarak headed Egypt. He is very happy to attack Venezuela in a recent report. They're very happy to attack every country that the United States doesn't like. Countries that the United States likes, like Ivan Duque's Colombia, I don't see them taking a strong position against what the government in Colombia is, not only allowing happen, but in many cases is suggesting to people to do, which is to kill social movement leaders like Patron, recently killed just a few weeks ago. What we see in India, the total calamity, these governments unable to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Meanwhile, the Chinese government has swiftly broken the chain of infection. In Laos, we have a socialist government. Infection is gone, almost gone. In Vietnam, the government using science, not a hallucinatory approach to COVID-19, but science, using the public sector, using public action and internationalism, has been fighting to tackle this pandemic. I mean, the last example I'm going to give you is Cuba. Cuba, extraordinary, the Cubans, despite for almost 70 years facing direct attack from the imperialists. Our Cuban comrades, 11 million people, have held their heads up and said, as Fidel Castro said in 1953, once a people win something, they will not give it up easily. 29,000 medical students walked out of their dormitories in Cuba and tested every one of the 11 million people living in Cuba. They tested everybody. They are taking care of their people. These small socialist experiments like we see in Cuba or we see in our many movements around the world, we are committed to the well-being of the people of the world. These other characters, these Bolsonaros, these Narendra Modis, these Donald Trumps, these people are principally committed to the small ruling bourgeoisie that wants to suck all of the wealth out of the world and leave the rest of us to starve on the streets. I mean, you have to make a choice. When you look at something that happened in Bolivia, you have to make a choice. Where do you want to stand? Do you want to stand with the hyperventilating liberalism of the New York Times, which is perfectly happy to see people starve on the streets of the United States, hasn't made hunger in the United States an issue? Or are you going to stand with people like Evo Morales? There's no choice here, friends. I mean, we're at a point in world history where you really have to pick a stand. Are you going to stand with the movements in Bolivia that were trying to bring justice to the people? Or are you going to stand with the military, with the fascists of that Santa Cruz committee? You're going to stand with the RSS in India? Are you going to stand with people like that? That's the choice you have. I've made my choice. I might sound to you like I'm just a little unnuanced for the 21st century. And let me tell you something. The 21st century doesn't give us the opportunity to be altogether nuanced.